Thank you so much. I just want to start by saying I am so honored to be in this space with this community. I consider myself really fortunate to be here, and this is a great privilege. My name is Bryan Stevenson, and I spend most of my time in jails and prisons. My work has not been focused on the HIV crisis and the health system. It's been focused actually on the criminal justice system. And I believe we're living at a time when there are these threats that are challenging all of us that we need to recognize. This is a very different country than it was 40 years ago. In 1972, we had 300,000 people in jails and prisons. Today, we have 2.3 million. The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We have 6 million people on probation and parole. There are 70 million Americans with criminal arrests, which means that when these people try to apply for jobs or try to get loans, they are disfavored. We've created a culture where we criminalize and demonize people for anything we can. We've declared a misguided war on drugs, and we have 1 million people in jails and prisons serving long prison sentences for simple possession of drugs. The number of women going to prison has increased 640% in the last 20 years. The statistic that really bothers me is the statistic from the Bureau of Justice. The Bureau of Justice now predicts that 1 in 3 black male babies is expected to go to jail or prison during his lifetime. 1 in 3. That wasn't true in the 20th century. That wasn't true in the 19th century. It became true in the 21st century. And I believe we have to change this country. I believe we actually have to do something to push against these forces that have created mass incarceration and excessive punishment. But I also believe that if we are going to change this country, if we're going to elevate social justice, we cannot step away from the crises that have impacted so many people in so many communities around HIV. I want to talk about how I think we can end the HIV epidemic. I want to talk about what I think it takes to change the world. And I just am so grateful for this opportunity. There are 4 things I really want to talk about. I think to change the world, to create justice, to end mass incarceration, to end the HIV epidemic, the first thing we have to do is we have to commit to getting proximate to the people and the places that we care about. You cannot make good decisions from a distance. I see this all the time. I see policymakers trying to figure out, well, what are the best protocols for dealing with this problem? What is the best strategy for managing this problem? And they're making these decisions from a distance. They're not intimate with the people and the communities where these problems are manifest. And I want to tell you that if you're not proximate, you cannot change the world. Proximity is critical because not only does it allow you to see things that you can't see from a distance, it allows you to hear things you can't hear from a distance. It's critical because it will also change you. Proximity will teach you things about yourself that you don't actually know. I'm a product of proximity. I grew up in the rural South where, when I was a little boy, black children couldn't go to the public schools. There were no high schools for black kids when my dad was a teenager, and lawyers came into our community and made them open up the public schools. And but for that intervention, but for those lawyers choosing to get proximate, I wouldn't be standing here. I got to go to high school. I loved being in high school. I got to go to college. First in my family to go to college. I loved being in college. I was very active in sports. I was very active in music. I was a philosophy major. When I was in college, I actually thought I should stay in college for the rest of my life. I just loved it that much. I would say to my friends every now and then, I said, oh, I'm going to go out on the hillside and I'm going to think some deep thoughts because I'm a philosophy major. And I realize now that what they probably thought I was saying was that I was going to go out on the hillside and get high or do drugs or something like that. But I wasn't. I was actually going out there thinking what I thought were these great deep thoughts. And then one day during my senior year, somebody came up to me and they said, well, what are you going to do after you graduate from college? And I heard this as a very hostile question because I realized that nobody was going to pay me to philosophize when I graduated. And what I didn't know what probably all of you knew. I just didn't have the right mentors. Nobody told me. I didn't know that in this country, if you try to do graduate work in history or English or political science, you actually have to know something about history, English, or political science. And that was pretty intimidating to me, and that's the reason why I ended up in law school. It was pretty clear to me that you don't need to know anything to go to law school. And so I signed up for that. And a few months later, I found myself at Harvard Law School, sitting in a classroom, been there for 2 months, and I woke up one morning, I was sitting there, I thought, man, you have made a terrible decision. This is not where you belong. And I was so disappointed because I went to law school because I was interested in dealing with racial bias. I wanted to do something about poverty. I wanted to talk about justice, and it didn't seem like anybody was talking about race or poverty or justice. I decided I was going to leave the law school. I finished my first year of law school, and I decided to go to the Harvard School of Government and pursue a degree in public policy. And I started at the School of Government. I'd been there 2 months, and I woke up one morning, and I was looking at myself in the mirror, and I thought to myself, wow, I'm even more miserable here than I was at the law school. They were teaching us to maximize benefits and minimize costs, but it didn't seem to matter whose benefits got maximized and whose costs got minimized. It was apolitical in this way. I couldn't make sense of it. And so I decided to go back to the law school, and I was trying to persuade myself that I could engage in a career practicing law that I knew was not going to be fully fulfilling, that I knew was not going to be affirming. And that's when I had this opportunity while I was in law school to get proximate. I went to Atlanta, Georgia to work with a human rights organization providing legal services to people on death row. And I found a community of lawyers that were deeply engaged by their work. They got up early in the morning, they worked hard all day, they stayed up late at night, and they were passionate and animated by their work. I'd been there a week, and the director said, we need you to go down to death row and explain to a man that he's not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And I came to the office the next day. I was excited, but I was nervous. I said, well, which lawyer is going to come with me to death row? They said, we don't have time to send a lawyer. You've got to go by yourself. And I got in my car, and I drove down to death row to meet this man, and I was so anxious. I knew he was going to be disappointed that I was just a law student. And I got to the prison, and I parked my car, and I walked into the prison. I was rehearsing exactly what I was going to say. But as I got inside the prison, I got nervous. It was dark and intimidating. The guards were very unfriendly. They took me back to this visitation room, and I was pacing back and forth, waiting for this man to come out. And finally, they opened the door, and there stood on the other side of the door was this condemned prisoner, this man sentenced to die. And my first impression of him was how weighed down with chains he was. He had handcuffs on his wrists. He had a chain around his waist. He had shackles on his ankles. It took them 15 minutes to get the chains off of him. And the longer it took to unchain him, the more nervous I became. And finally, when he was unchained and he walked over to me, I forgot everything that I'd rehearsed to say. And I just started saying, I'm so sorry. I'm just a law student. I don't know anything about the death penalty. I don't know anything about constitutional law. I don't know anything about criminal law. I don't know anything about due process. But they sent me down here to tell you that you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And as soon as I said that, the man said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And the man said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And that's when this man grabbed my hand and he said, thank you, thank you, thank you. He said, you're the first person I've talked to who's not a death row prisoner or a death row guard. He said, I've been talking to my wife and kids on the phone, but I didn't let them come and visit because I was afraid I'd have an execution date, and I didn't want them to have to deal with that. He said, now because of you, I'm going to see my wife. I'm going to see my kids. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I couldn't have guessed that even in my ignorance, being proximate could have an impact on the quality of someone's life. We started having this conversation. And this amazing thing happened. It turned out we were exactly the same age, same month, same day, same year. He started asking me questions about my life. I started asking him questions about his life. We started talking, and 15 minutes turned into an hour turned into 2 hours, and we kept talking. 2 hours turned into 3 hours, and we were lost in conversation. I'd only scheduled to be there an hour, and the guards were getting angry that I was staying in there for so long. And finally, after 3 hours, the guards came bursting into the room. They were angry. And they couldn't do anything to me, but they treated this man very roughly. They threw him against the wall, and they were complaining about how long we'd been in there. I tried to get them to calm down, but they ignored me. They put the handcuffs on his wrist really tightly. I could see him grimacing from pain. They wrapped the chain around his waist. I could see him grimacing. I said, please, be gentler. It's my fault, not his fault. And the man looked at me and said, Bryan, don't you worry about this. You just come back. And then he took those shackles and he put the shackles on his ankles, and I could see him grimacing, and they were treating him so roughly. And then they began shoving him out of the room. He almost fell down as they shoved him, and they kept pushing him. And before he got to the door, I watched him as he did something very unusual. This last time, he planted his feet, and this next time, when they tried to push him, he didn't move. And then that man did something I've never forgotten. He looked at me, he said, Bryan, don't you worry about this. You just come back. And then I stood there and watched him do something I've never forgotten. He stood there and he closed his eyes. And then he threw his head back. And then he started to sing. And he started singing this hymn I used to hear all the time when I was a kid growing up. He started singing, "I'm pressing on the upward way. New heights I'm gaining every day. Still praying as I'm onward bound." And then he said, "Lord, plant my feet on higher ground." It started pushing this man down the hallway. You could hear the chains clanging, but you could still hear him singing about higher ground. And I will tell you, something in that moment changed me. All of a sudden, I knew I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. But more than that, I knew that my journey to higher ground was tied to his journey to higher ground. If he doesn't get there, I don't get there. And I will tell you that proximity radicalized my interest in the law. I went back to Harvard Law School. You couldn't get me out of the law school library. I was in that library because I needed to know everything about criminal law. I needed to know everything about constitutional law. I needed to know everything about substantive due process and procedural due process and federalism and every aspect and corner and subset of the law. I needed to know it because I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. Proximity will empower you. It will change you. Don't run away from the places where the incidence of HIV infection is the highest. Don't run away from the communities that are struggling with poverty and suffering and disability and discrimination. Don't run away from the jails and prisons that have become warehouses for too many people in our society. Don't run away from the places where there's mental illness and mental illness. There is something for you there. And if you get proximate, we will find the answer to HIV infection. Not in labs, not in Washington, not in big courthouses. We'll find it in communities where people are suffering and struggling. It's there that we will find answers that we can't find anyplace else. There's power in proximity. The second thing, it's not enough to get proximate. I think we have to change the narrative. The problems that we are dealing with in the health system, in HIV, are not just problems that are defined by a virus or defined by this. There is a narrative that sustains these problems. Mass incarceration has been sustained by a narrative. The politics of fear and anger is what I call them. For 40 years, we've had politicians competing with each other over who can be the toughest on crime. And this narrative has emerged. And nobody wants to talk about rehabilitation. Nobody wants to talk about correction. Nobody wants to talk about compassion. Nobody wants to talk about mercy. We just want to talk about punishment and how tough we are. And that narrative has created problems. My clients have actually gotten younger and younger and younger. I represent children prosecuted as adults. The United States is the only country in the world that condemns children to die in prison. We have 3,000 children in this country sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. There are 250,000 people serving long prison sentences for crimes they were accused of when they were children. There are 15 states that have no minimum age for trying a child as an adult. I represent 10 and 11-year-old kids who are sometimes looking at decades in an adult prison. Well, there's a narrative behind that. 30 years ago, we had some criminologists going around talking about how some kids aren't really kids. They said that these children might look like children, they might act like children, but don't be deceived, these aren't children. They came up with a new word for them. They said that these aren't children. They said these kids are, quote, super predators. That was the label they used, and every state in the country reacted. Every state lowered the minimum age for trying children as adults. We made it easier to impose these mandatory sentences on children, and today there is this crisis. I go into communities and I talk to 12 and 13-year-old boys and girls, and many of them, when we have honest conversation, will say things that break my heart, but they're being honest. They'll say to me, "Mr. Stevenson, I know I'm going to be in jail or prison by the time I'm 21. So I've got to go out here and live my life a certain way. I've got to go out here and do this. I can't worry about school. I can't worry about," and that hopelessness is a function of this narrative. I was working on a case some years ago involving a 14-year-old boy who lived in a household where his mother was repeatedly the target of a lot of domestic violence. She had a boyfriend who would sometimes start drinking. When this man started drinking, he'd get violent. And one day he'd been drinking and he came home. He called the boy's mother into the kitchen. He didn't say anything. She walked into the kitchen and he just punched her in the face. She hit her head as she fell down and she was on the floor unconscious, bleeding. Her son came running into the room. He was so worried about his mother. He saw her lying on the floor covered with blood. He tried to get her to wake up. He tried to revive her, but she wouldn't respond. And this child thought his mom was dead. She wasn't dead, but he thought she was dead. Well, this little boy got up and he walked into the bedroom where the man had fallen asleep, and he walked over to a dresser drawer where he knew this man kept his handgun. And he opened that drawer and he pulled out the gun, and he walked over to where the man was sleeping, and he pointed the gun at the man's head. The man had been snoring, and when the man stopped snoring, this little boy tragically pulled the trigger, shot the man in the head. The man died almost instantly. Now, this little boy was very small for his age. He was about 5 feet tall. He weighed under 100 pounds. He'd never been in trouble before. No prior juvenile adjudications, and he was the kind of kid that might have been tried as a juvenile, but for the fact that the man that he shot and killed, his mother's boyfriend, that man was a deputy sheriff. And because he was a deputy sheriff, the prosecutor insisted that this child be tried as an adult, and the judge certified him to stand trial as an adult, and they put him in the adult jail. His grandmother called me after he'd been there for 3 days and asked me to get involved, and I went to the jail. And I sat down, this little boy walked out. I started asking him questions, but he wouldn't say anything. I kept asking him questions. I couldn't get him to say a word. I put my pen down and I said, look, I can't help you if you don't talk to me. You got to talk to me. He just kept staring at the wall. I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. He just kept staring. I got up, I walked around the table, I pulled my chair close to him. I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. Wouldn't say a word, just kept staring. At some point, I didn't know what to do, and I just leaned on him. I don't even know why. I leaned on him. But when I leaned on him, I felt him lean back. And when he leaned back, I put my arm around him, and I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. And that's when this little boy started to cry. And through his tears, he began talking to me not about what happened with his mom, not about what happened with the man. He started talking to me about what had happened at the jail. He told me on the first night several men had hurt him. He told me on the next night several people had raped him. He told me on the night before I'd gotten there, so many people had hurt him, he couldn't remember how many there had been. And I held this little boy while he cried hysterically for almost an hour. I said, look, I'm going to get you out of here. And I remember trying to leave, and he grabbed me by the arm with such intensity. He said, please don't go. I said, no, I'm going to be back. I'm going to get you out of here. And I left the jail, and the question I had as I left the jail is, who is responsible for this? And the answer is, we are. We've allowed a narrative to emerge in this country that some children are not children. And a society that begins to throw away its children, a society that throws away its sick, a society that throws away the poor, throws away the disfavored, is a society doomed for failure. I believe that. I believe that all children are children. And this gap that we have created between ourselves and the children that are struggling, the children that are traumatized, the children that are living in communities where they're born into violent families and they are living in violent households and they go to violent schools and they're chased by violent gangs and they're being threatened by schools who want to expel them and suspend them. And at some point they want to do something to relieve themselves from the stress and the trauma, so they pick up drugs or they engage in risky behavior, and then we condemn them some more for the choices that they have made without ever understanding how that trauma has shaped those choices. That narrative has to change. I think we have to change the narrative in this country about race. You see, I think we have all been infected by our history of racial inequality, all of us. We've been compromised by a narrative of racial difference. It burdens us. It compromises. It doesn't allow us to recognize illness and the need for care and treatment in poor and minority communities. It has confused us when it comes to thinking about whose lives matter. This narrative is a problem, and we've got to talk about the race. I actually think we have to talk about slavery. You see, I don't think we ever dealt with the legacy of slavery in America. You see, I don't think the great evil of American slavery was involuntary servitude or forced labor. I think the great evil of American slavery was this narrative of racial difference that we created to legitimate it. There were lots of countries across the world that had slavery. In most societies, slavery was transitional. It was something that might happen to anybody. But in the United States, we weren't a society that created slaves. We became a slave society. We made up an ideology to legitimate it. We actually made it something permanent and hereditary tied toward race, and because of that, we created this great evil. And when we dealt with slavery in the middle of the 19th century, we talked about involuntary servitude, we talked about this forced labor, but we didn't talk about this ideology of white supremacy. And because of that, I don't think slavery ended in 1865, I think it just evolved. It turned into decades of racial hierarchy and racial terror. We just put out a report at EJI on lynching. Thousands of people of color lynched in this country, in the American South, and we never dealt with it. We never talked about it. And what we don't appreciate is that the geography, the demographic geography that sometimes makes HIV infection so intense in particular communities was shaped by this era of racial terror. You see, we have black people in Cleveland, in Chicago, in Detroit, in Los Angeles, in Oakland, in Boston, in New York, in Minneapolis, in communities all across the North and the Midwest. And what we don't remember is that the black people who came to these communities didn't come as immigrants looking for new opportunities. They came as refugees and exiles from terror. In the beginning of the 1900s, 90-some% of the black population lived in the Deep South. They fled during the Great Migration in the first 40 years of the 20th century from terror, and that terrorism was never addressed. And we've tolerated and we've moved people around and we've created these ghettos and these spaces where people don't get the services that they need, and because of that, there are burdens in these communities that we don't understand. You know, we're having the 50th anniversary of a lot of things. It's the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act and the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act and the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. But even when we talk about civil rights in this country, I get worried. I hear people talking about the civil rights movement, and it just is so celebratory. Everybody gets to celebrate. We don't ask any qualifying questions before we let people celebrate. And I hear people talking about the civil rights movement, and it sounds like a 3-day carnival. On day 1, Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat on a bus. On day 2, Dr. King led a march on Washington. And on day 3, we just changed all the laws. And if that was our history, I mean, we'd be a great country. But that's not our history. Our history is that for decades in this country, we humiliated black people. For decades, we burdened and battered and excluded. For decades, we told people of color, you're not smart enough to go to school with us. For decades, we said, you're not good enough to vote. And these injuries accumulated and these burdens accumulated, and we have not addressed the injuries and the burdens that our legacy of racial inequality has created. You see, I believe we need truth and reconciliation in this country. I don't think we're going to recover from this history without truth and reconciliation. In South Africa, there was a recognition that we weren't going to get past apartheid without truth and reconciliation. If you go to Rwanda, there's a recognition that there won't be recovery from the genocide without truth and reconciliation. Go to Germany. You can't go 100 meters in Berlin, Germany, without seeing a marker or a stone that marks a spot where a Jewish family was abducted and taken to the concentration camps. The Germans actually want you to go to the camps and reflect soberly on the history of the Holocaust. In this country, we do the opposite. You start talking about race and people get nervous. You start talking about racial justice and people are looking for exits, and we've got to change that narrative. And I genuinely believe on the other side of truth and reconciliation, there is freedom. Not just for people of color, for all of us, there is freedom. We can get to the point where we don't bump into each other, where we don't think the worst of one another. On the other side of truth and reconciliation, there is freedom. Just like on the other side of engaging with HIV and the health crisis that we are in, there is healing. But we've got to change the narrative. Third thing, I don't think it's enough to get proximate and change the narrative. The third thing we've got to do is we have got to protect our hopefulness. You see, I don't believe we can change the world until we are dedicated to staying hopeful about what we can do. Hope is essential. I am persuaded that injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. Disease prevails where hopelessness persists. Infection rates go up where hopelessness persists, and we have got to confront this hopelessness. Hope is essential. Havel talked about it. Havel in Eastern Europe during the time of Soviet domination said the kind of hope we need is not a preference for optimism over pessimism. It's not some pie-in-the-sky attitude. Havel says the kind of hope you need to change the world is rather an orientation of the spirit, a willingness to sometimes position yourself in hopeless places and be a witness. And that's what I think so many of you are doing. You're insisting that we go into the places where there's been a lot of trauma, where there's been a lot of infection, where there's been a lot of disease, where there's been a lot of distress. And if we don't continue to do that, we will not end this epidemic. We will not make the change we have to do. I really value hope because hope will get you to stand up when other people are saying, sit down. Hope will get you to speak when other people are saying, be quiet. I sometimes have to worry about the things that make me hopeless. You have to all understand what will challenge your hope dynamic. What might challenge your hope dynamic might not challenge my hope dynamic, but you've got to be attentive to it. You really do. When I was a young lawyer, I had the great privilege of meeting Rosa Parks and spending time with her. And Ms. Parks was an amazing person. And there was a woman in Montgomery named Johnny Carr. She was the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott. Amazing woman. And when I moved to Montgomery as a young lawyer, Ms. Carr called me up and she said, "Bryan, I understand you're a young lawyer." I said, "Yes, I am." She said, "Well, my name is Johnny Carr. I'm the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott." I said, "All right." She said, "Well, since you're a young lawyer, I'm going to call you up sometimes. I'm going to ask you to go some places and speak." And then she said, "Sometimes I'm going to call you up and go some places and listen." And she said, "Now, when I call you up and ask you to do something, you're going to say, 'Yes, ma'am.'" So I said, "Yes, ma'am." And one day she called me up and she said, "Bryan, Ms. Parks is coming to town and we're going to get together and talk with me and Ms. Parks and Ms. Durr. Virginia Durr is a white woman whose husband Clifford Durr represented Dr. King. And they said, we're going to get together and talk." She said, "Do you want to come over and listen?" I said, "Yes, ma'am, I do." And then she'd sometimes say, she said, "Now, what does the word listen mean, Bryan?" I'd have to let her know I wasn't supposed to say anything. And I went over and I listened to these women talk for 2 hours and they were so engaged. But what was amazing to me that they were so full of hope. They weren't talking about what they had done. They were talking about what they were going to do. In their 70s and their 80s, they still had this hope that they could make a difference in confronting the despair and inequality and injustice sit all around them. And I sat there and I just soaked it all in. And at one point, Ms. Parks turned to me and she said, "Now, Bryan, tell me what the Equal Justice Initiative is. Tell me what you're trying to do." And I looked at Ms. Carr to see if I had permission to speak, and she nodded. And I gave Ms. Parks my rap. I said, "Well, we're trying to do something to end the death penalty. We're trying to do something to confront conditions of confinement. We're trying to do something to end mass incarceration. We're trying to do something to deal with racism and racial bias. We're trying to do something about poverty. We're trying to do something about gender inequality. We're trying to do something about helping children who are prosecuted as adults. We're trying to do something about how there are the marginalized communities." I gave her my whole rap, and when I finished, she looked at me. She said, She said, "That's going to make you tired, tired, tired." And that's when Ms. Carr leaned forward and she put her finger in my face and she said, "That's why you've got to be brave, brave, brave." I know there's a lot of hopeful people in this room. You could not do what you do without your hope. And I just want to tell you that I know you get tired, but you be brave. When you stay brave, when you keep your hope moving forward, that's how we change the world. That's how we will end this epidemic. Fourth and finally, I wish I could stop at 3. I wish I could just say, get proximate, change narratives, and stay hopeful. But I have to say the fourth thing, the fourth and final thing. It's not enough if we get proximate. It's not enough that we change narratives. It's not enough if we stay hopeful. The fourth thing we have to do is that we sometimes have to do uncomfortable things. I hate saying that because I know that human beings are programmed to do what's comfortable. We've got a lot of medical people in the room who understand the biology of choice and the psychology of choice, and I know we are programmed to seek what's comfortable. But I'm here to tell you that if we want to end this epidemic, if we want to change the world, if we want to create more justice, we are going to have to sometimes do uncomfortable things. I look at the history of the world when we've made great strides toward freedom and justice, we've made change in the world, and I can't see a narrative where people only did the things that were comfortable and convenient. Every time we've made progress, it's because someone has done something uncomfortable. And I think we have to do it. People get on the stage and they start insisting that we pay attention to the needs and challenges of the trans community. It's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. We have to do uncomfortable. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not here to speak against comfort. I'm not saying I'm all against comfort. I like comfort. I went to Mississippi to give a talk not too long ago, and I got off the plane. The people met me at the airport. They said, "Oh, Mr. Stevenson, we know all about you. We know what kind of person you are. We know what kind of work you do. And we're having our conference at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. And we decided that you wouldn't want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel." They said, "We've asked one of the farmers to put you up at the barn." I said, "What is wrong with you?" I said, "Of course I want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. I like those cookies just like everybody else." That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that sometimes you have to choose to do uncomfortable things because it's the necessary thing. I've spent my career representing people on death row. And we've had some wonderful moments. We've had some success. We just got a man released who spent 30 years on death row for a crime he didn't commit. He walked home 4 months ago, and I've been happy every day. I talk to him every day. I talk to him, and it's empowering me. But I will tell you that not every day has been like that. We've also had these moments that were so painful. Between 2009 and 2011, the highest execution rate in America was in the state of Alabama. We had 17 executions in a 30-month time period. Every other month, somebody was being executed. And what people don't know about our system is that there is no right to counsel, even for people on death row. After your trial and your appeal, we don't provide lawyers to people. And we have these people literally dying for legal assistance. And there is no public defender system in my state, and we couldn't get anybody to provide services. And so we committed to represent all the people with execution dates. And I have this beautiful staff of young lawyers, and the lawyers are getting beat down by these men who are being executed. And I said, I've been doing this longer than the rest of y'all. Let me take the next one, and y'all take a break. And I got involved in the case of a man who was suffering from intellectual disability. And our courts have banned the execution of people with intellectual disability, but nonetheless, nobody had raised the issue. And one of the challenges in our system is that we tend to prioritize finality over fairness. And so I got involved and started arguing that this man can't be executed because he suffers from intellectual disability. He has mental retardation. You can't execute him. But each court said too late. The trial court said too late. The state appellate court said too late. The federal court said too late. And finally, it was the day of his execution. I was waiting for word from the U.S. Supreme Court, and I got this dreadful order from the court denying our stay motion, essentially saying, too late. It was an hour before the execution, and I picked up the phone to call this man and give him his terrible news. And when I gave him this news, you could just hear the heartbreak. And in addition to being intellectually disabled, this man had another challenge. When he got nervous, when he got anxious, when he got worried, he couldn't get his words out. He would begin to stutter really, really badly. He had this very severe speech impediment that would just get worse when he was anxious. And he told me he had something to say to me, but he couldn't get his words out. He was begging me not to get off the phone until he said what he had to say, but then he couldn't get his words out. And I was listening to this man try to get the words out, straining so hard, struggling so hard to get his words out, but he couldn't. And the harder he tried, the more he was just ripping my heart apart. And I was standing there, and I could hear the guards in the background trying to make him move faster, which just made it worse. And they were saying, we've got to go, we've got to go. And he was trying, and he couldn't get his words out. And I was just devastated. Tears started running down my face. I remembered something I'd actually forgotten. I remembered how when I was about 9 years old, my mother had taken me to church one Sunday, and I was there with my brother, and we were talking with our friends, and there was a little skinny kid standing next to one of my friends. And this little boy wasn't saying anything, and at some point I asked him what his name was or where he was from, and I remembered that night how when I asked him that, this little boy couldn't get his words out. He also struggled with this speech impediment, this stutter. And because I'd never dealt with anybody with that particular challenge, I did something really ignorant. I laughed. And my mother was standing across the room, and she saw me laughing at this little boy, and when she saw me laughing, she gave me this look I'd never seen before. And she came across the room, and she grabbed me by the arm, and she pulled me aside, and she said, Bryan, don't you ever laugh at somebody because they can't get their words out right. Don't you ever do that. I said, I'm sorry, Mom, I didn't mean to. She said, no, you know better than that. And then my mother said to me, now you go back over there and tell that little boy you're sorry. I said, okay, and I took a step, and my mother grabbed me by the arm. She said, wait a minute. After you tell that little boy you're sorry, I want you to hug that little boy. Rolled my eyes a little bit. I said, okay, Mom. And I took a step, and she grabbed me by the arm again. She said, wait. She said, after you hug that little boy, I want you to tell that little boy you love him. I said, Mom, I can't go over there and say I love you. And she gave me that look again. So I said, okay. And I remembered going over to this little boy and walking up to him and saying, look, man, I'm sorry. And then I sort of lunged at him and gave him my little boy version of a man hug. And what I remembered that night, the night of that execution, was how I said to that little boy as insincerely as I possibly could, I said, I love you. And what I'd forgotten but remembered all of a sudden was how that little boy hugged me back and whispered flawlessly in my ear. He said, I love you too. And I was thinking about that while this man was trying to get his words out, and the tears were just running down my face. And finally he said, Mr. Stevenson, I just want you to know, I'm so grateful that you chose to represent me. I want to thank you for fighting for me. And then he said, I love you for trying to save my life. Hung up the phone, took him away, put him on a gurney, and executed him. I hung up the phone. I thought to myself, I can't do this anymore. It's too hard. I kept thinking about how broken he was. And the question I had in my mind is, why in this country do we hate the broken? What is it about us that when we see brokenness, we want to crush it, we want to kill it, we want to throw it away, we don't want to have anything to do with anything that's broken? What is it about us that we respond that way? And then I realized that my life is filled with brokenness. All of my clients are broken people. They've been broken by racism. They've been broken by poverty. They've been broken by disease. They've been broken by disability. They've been broken by exclusion and marginalization. They've been broken by trauma. Broken, broken, broken. I work in a broken system of justice. People too distant to actually know what it means to be compassionate, to do justice. They're too far away to actually see the humanity in front of them. A broken system. I said, I don't want to do this anymore. And that's when I had to have that conversation you have to have with yourself when you're making these big decisions. I started thinking, well, why have you been doing this? And all of a sudden, I realized something I'd never realized before. That night, I realized that I don't do what I do because I've been trained to do it. I don't do what I do because somebody's got to do it. I don't do what I do because of mass incarceration and excessive punishment. I don't do what I do because it's important that someone do it. I don't do what I do because if I don't do it, nobody will. I don't do what I do because I get to talk to wonderful people like you. I realized something that night I'd never realized before. And what I realized is that I do what I do because I'm broken too. The truth is, that if you get proximate, if you change narratives, if you stay hopeful, if you do uncomfortable things, it will break you. But there's a power in brokenness. When you're broken, you know something about compassion. When you're broken, you know something about grace. When you're broken, you know something about mercy. You know something about the human spirit. And it's in brokenness that we actually will find the cure to this epidemic. I believe really simple things. I believe that each person is more than the worst thing they've ever done. I believe if somebody tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if somebody takes something that doesn't belong to them, they're not just a thief. I believe even if you kill somebody, you're not just a killer. People with HIV are not just people with HIV. We've got to understand that we are more than our worst decisions. The second thing I believe is I don't believe that poverty, I don't believe the opposite of poverty in this country is wealth. We talk too much about money in America. We do. I don't believe that the opposite of poverty is wealth. I believe that in this country, in most of the communities that we are working, I don't believe the opposite of poverty is wealth. I believe the opposite of poverty is justice. And when we commit ourselves to just treatment for all people, just care, just systems, that's when we get to a place. And third and finally, I don't think we can judge how we do in this country by looking at how we treat the powerful and the rich and the privileged. I think we have to judge how we're doing in this country by looking at how we treat the poor and the incarcerated and the diseased. And finally, the health of this nation, for all of us, can't be evaluated by how we're dealing with people who are not struggling with the issues that we are struggling with. You know, I look at our health system, and we have a healthcare system that frequently cares better for people who are rich and well than poor and sick. And because of that, we haven't done what we have to do. So I'm persuaded that if we choose to get proximate, if we change this narrative, if we stay hopeful and we do some uncomfortable things, we can change the world. We can end this epidemic, and I'll end with this. There's a different metric system for those of you who are doing this. For those of you who are staying proximate, who are using your hope, who are changing narratives, who are doing uncomfortable things, let me just end by saying to this you, don't judge how you're doing by how much money you make, by how many people know your name, by how many people applaud for you. There's a different metric system for you. I learned it from an old man. I was giving a talk in a church, and this old man came into the church, and he was sitting in a wheelchair in the back of the church. And he was looking at me with this really harsh, almost angry look on his face. And I kept giving my talk, but he was staring at me so hard, I was getting worried that something was going to happen. He was just staring at me. And I got through the talk, and everybody was nice. They came up, and they shook my hand. They were very appropriate, but the man was still sitting in the back staring at me. And finally, when everybody else left, he got a little boy, this man in the back, to wheel him down to me. And he came wheeling down the middle aisle of that church, and he got in front of me. And when he got in front of me, he had that very stern, angry look on his face. He put his hand up, and he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I just stood there and looked at him. And he asked me again, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I stepped back, and I started mumbling something to myself. And he said one last time, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And then he said, "I'm going to tell you what you're doing." And this older man looked at me. He says, "You're beating the drum for justice." He said, "You keep beating the drum for justice." And I I will tell you, I was so moved. I was so moved. I was also really relieved, but I was more. And then he said, come here, come here, come here. And he grabbed me by my jacket. He pulled me into his wheelchair. He said, I'm going to show you something. And this older man turned his head. He said, you see this cut I have behind my right ear? He said, I got that cut in Greene County, Alabama, 1963, trying to register people to vote. He said, you see the scar I have down here in the bottom of my neck? He said, I got that scar in Philadelphia, Mississippi, 1964, trying to register people to vote. He turned his head. He said, you see this dark spot? He said, that's my bruise. I got my bruise in Birmingham, Alabama, 1965, trying to register people to vote. He said, I'm going to tell you something, young man. He said, people look at me. They think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars. He said, but I'm going to tell you something. He said, these aren't my cuts. These aren't my bruises. These aren't my scars. He said, these are my medals of honor. And I know that many of you have to do critically important things to help those who are disfavored, to those who have been excluded, those who have been marginalized, those who have been forgotten, that sometimes feel like they're injuries, that feel like they're cuts and bruises and scars, but you honor this movement. You honor social justice. You honor our claim to be part of a better place, a more just place when you do that. And I just want to celebrate you for taking up that cause, for getting proximate, for staying hopeful, for changing narratives, and yes, for doing uncomfortable things. God bless all of you. Thank you.